This video will provide an overview of the lessons for week 26, days 42 through 46. This week, students will start wrapping up task 4, their controlled experiments, by revising their conclusions, revisiting ideas around heat transfer, and reflecting on their work so far. First, on day 42, students will have an opportunity to discuss their ideas and findings about temperature change. Then, they'll revise and self-assess their scientific explanations based on the results of their experiments. The following day, students will elaborate on their understandings of thermal energy by applying their knowledge to a new situation involving food coloring and water at different temperatures. Next, on day 44, students will use videos and online simulations to study how energy is transferred between particles of matter. On day 45, students will begin wrapping up task 4 by connecting what they've learned to the cross-cutting concepts for the unit. Finally, this week, students will connect their learning to the final culminating project for the unit. Let's go through the key points from each day, starting with the lesson for day 42. On day 42, students will continue in the explain phase by revising their scientific conclusions based on their experiments. In small groups, students will discuss what they discovered through experimentation about what factors affect or cause changes in temperature. As a class, discuss how and why temperature changes. Encourage students to provide concrete evidence from their own experiments and from each other's experiments. The pink boxes to the right provide helpful sentence frames for students to use in order to share and make connections to the cross-cutting concepts in the unit, like scale, proportion, and quantity. The diagram of cloud type formation may also be used to help students make broader connections between their experiments and their study of climate. Students should then complete or revise their scientific explanations on page 10 of the student handout. The checklist on slide 16 is for students to self-assess their scientific explanations. It will likely be helpful for students to go over this checklist before they finish writing their explanations and to have access to it while they are revising. That way they can identify any missing components and add them. You may also need to define some of the terms in the rubric based on your class and your students. How much data is adequate? 2 data points? 5? Does multiple sources mean more than one experimental group in an experiment? Or does it mean multiple classmates' experiments? What about adequate scientific ideas or principles? Do students need to refer to temperature as well as thermal energy transfer? Do they need to define which form of heat occurs in their experiment? Of course, there are no right answers to these questions, but before you assess students' conclusions, be sure to answer them for yourself. That way you will be able to help students revise their conclusions to meet your standards and expectations. The next day, students will move from the explain phase of task 4 into the elaborate phase. This means that students will now take what they've learned through their experiments and apply their knowledge to a new situation. The new situation is a teacher-led demonstration that uses food coloring added to water at different temperatures. A more in-depth video showing and explaining this demonstration is included with the slides for day 43. After hearing about the setup of the demonstration, students should write a hypothesis to explain what they predict will happen. Remember, a scientific hypothesis must include the word because. Students shouldn't just state what they think will happen, but also explain why. During the demonstration, students should jot down their observations in order to collect evidence. After watching the demonstration, students should evaluate the validity of their hypothesis. Were they correct? Why or why not? Make sure that students base their evaluation on actual evidence from the demonstration. On day 44, students will continue the elaborate phase by investigating particle-level explanations of conduction, a form of thermal energy transfer. Remember, students saw part of this video back on day 34 when they were explaining how a metal spoon left in a pot of cooking pasta would increase in temperature. Now that they know more about temperature and heat transfer, students will likely be better able to make sense of the concepts in the video. The video provides a great visual explanation at the particle level of how thermal energy is actually transferred by conduction. After watching the video, give students an opportunity to explain in their own words how conduction can cause changes in an object's temperature. Then, give students some time to explore the simulation linked on slide 15. Although this simulation is not about heat transfer specifically, it does provide a good model of how collisions between atoms and molecules can transfer energy. Another video provided with the slides for day 44 goes into more depth about this simulation and other examples of particle collisions and energy transfer. After using the simulation, students should apply their findings to the previous day's demonstration of food coloring added to different temperatures of water. They should be able to explain that the hotter the water is, the faster the water molecules are moving. This means that they will collide more frequently and more energetically with the molecules of food coloring, thus spreading the color out more rapidly. Meanwhile, the water molecules in the coldest water move more slowly and thus spread out the food coloring more slowly. Students should also draw connections between the simulation, the food coloring demonstration, and their own independent investigations from the previous week. On day 45, students will transition to the evaluate phase, drawing task 4 to a close with reflection and connections. Give students an opportunity to draw connections between everything they've done so far in task 4, their own experiments, the videos they've watched, the food coloring demonstration, and even the simulations from the previous day. A chance to discuss in small groups will help students exchange ideas and brainstorm some new connections of their own, as well as develop new questions. Then it's time to return to the interactive bulletin board and the class concept map so students can articulate the connections they've made. Focus on connecting their learning to the cross-cutting concepts of energy and matter, scale, proportion, and quantity, and patterns. Make sure students have access to the interactive bulletin board so they can use the accumulated vocabulary and helpful sentence frames. Finally, students will continue wrapping up Task 4 by connecting their learning to the unit culminating project. Give students a chance to review their chosen region for their project. Then they can apply their learning so far to explain why their region has the climate it does. Now that students have learned more about thermal energy and temperature change, they can brainstorm more ideas and add more details to their project idea. Will their product help people stay warm in a cold climate or cool in a hot climate? Will they require their product to conduct heat or insulate from it? How will they do this? What materials should they use or avoid, and what other factors should they consider? The majority of class time should be spent giving students time to answer these questions. It's important for students to remember the human element in all of this. Thermal energy, heat transfer, particles, they're all interesting, but ultimately the purpose of this project is to impact the lives of other people. Help students consider the ultimate impact on people's lives that their product could have. Remember, each slide deck comes with a cover slide with links to Google Docs and other materials. The following slides provide helpful content, background information, suggestions for teaching synchronously or asynchronously, language development supports, and supports for ELs and students with disabilities. Those are the major tasks and key points for week 26 as students start to wrap up Task 4, Investigating Changes in Temperature.